In the White House, President Eisenhower signs a proclamation that makes Alaska's entry into the Union official.
This frozen land of desolation, twice the size of Texas, has since developed into a source of fabulous wealth.
And in 1959, when Alaska became a state, the Statehood Act authorized the state to select 104 million acres without compensation. Once the state began its selection process, it became painfully clear that Alaska Native people would be affected.
I think that people had better wake up to the fact that this is a very critical year for Alaska as far as I'm concerned.
Our relationships are friendly, but there are many economic problems and social problems that do need to be settled.
Well, ANCSA, as it's commonly known, is our land claim settlement that the Alaska Natives pushed for between 1966 and 1971. Very concentrated period. It was the culmination of about a 100-year phase in which the United States never came to grips with the question of actually who owned Alaska, because of the Statehood Act authorizing the new state to select over 100 million acres of our land. Of course, it precipitated a crisis for Alaska Natives who we felt Alaska belonged to us.
Alaska Natives were never conquered. Their land had never been touched by Russians. They couldn't comprehend, one, the concept of private ownership of land, and secondly, how people they never met could have sold their land to the United States.
They make laws, they don't tell us anything about it, and say this is the new law now. So we started shaking our fists at them. I mean, we weren't getting along with anybody. We just said, you gotta treat us fair. We're humans just like you. Except these are our ways.
During that period of time after statehood in 1958 and before the settlement bill, Native Alaskans were coming into conflict with the government in nearly every region. The communities were disjointed like they'd always been, but a confluence of events was starting to take shape that would change all of it. One of the driving factors that started it all was the Rampart Dam.
Of course, as you know, we're trying to develop low-cost power through building the dam at Rampart on the Yukon, the largest man-made lake in the world. It will be 10% bigger than Lake Erie.
It's utterly mind-blowing to think that that was once a plan for our interior region, for our Yukon River. It would have destroyed everything. It would have destroyed our subsistence way of life. It would have destroyed our villages. It's completely inconceivable to me that the government would even have considered this.
They be Ernest Gruening and a movement within in the United States to build the largest lake in the world, and the Rampart Dam. And it was supposedly for energy, and I'm a great supporter of hydropower, always have been, but I got very irritated about the idea that they were going to dam and flood the valley. You had a lake with 15 million acres, the biggest lake, I say, ever created by man in the world.
The lake created by the dam would have flooded 9 separate villages in the region.
Just flooded them, including mine. And I went to bat, and we fought this thing back and forth. I was actually looked down upon by Ed Toussaint and a few other people that were in the business of owning property in Fort Yukon, but I said, this is wrong. And that did sort of solidify those villages into an idea that here was an outside source and force trying to flood them without any input. Well, the comment from the government was, well, we'll move you. Sounds like China. Well, that was not what we wanted, and we did win by a fluke in a sense, because the Vietnam War started, and the money for that dam went to the war, so we didn't build a dam. Best things ever happened on the Vietnam War, by the way.
And while a war likely ended the Rampart Dam project for the interior, the vestiges of another war created a different problem for the people of the North.
Project Chariot, we're going to use nuclear power to create a harbor. That was the whole idea.
Created in seconds with the tremendous energy of the peaceful atom.
The controversial project was proposed here at Cape Thompson, near Tikigaq, Point Hope, by Edward Teller.
The importance of a scientific discovery is not measured by its consequences.
The father of the atomic bomb.
Should the scientists make a distinction between destructive and constructive application?
Look, the answer is no.
Point Hope, one of the oldest continuously occupied communities in North America, was facing a forced abandonment if the project went through.
They laid a whole series of nuclear bombs underwater or under the ground, and then they set them off, and it would raise the land up and it would sink, and they'd have a harbor. It wasn't a new idea. They did have one out of Amchitka. They had a test out of Amchitka.
The explosion's radioactive fallout is almost as dangerous as the blast itself.
Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And in response to the nuclear project, a young man from Point Hope, Howard Rock, stepped up and created what would become a key weapon in the upcoming battle for settlement.
The Tender Times cannot be underscored as such a pivotal part of the ANCSA movement and part of the movement overall during the 60s and 70s. For the first time, the Tender Times newspaper gave Natives a voice. My mom joined the board of the Tender Times in the early days with the great Inupiat leader Howard Rock, who she became very good friends with.
He was one of ours. He was, from Point Hope. He was a whaler and became a masterful writer.
Howard used the newly formed paper to bring attention to Project Chariot and helped to rally enough interest to stop the project.
It unified us in several huge causes. It gave voice to opposition to the nuclear Project Chariot and the Rampart Dam, which would have destroyed our Koyukon Athabascan ancestral lands that my elders had lived on for generations.
And in the same way the Rampart Dam helped interior Alaska Native villages band together, Project Chariot brought together the North Slope.
The Tender Times was a reliable vehicle, even though it had just a small circulation. But the politicians read it, and government officials read it.
Alaska Natives from around the state were coming together regionally and organizing. At the same time, the state of Alaska was trying to select the lands that they were promised by Congress in the Statehood Act.
And Alaska State Legislature was selecting 103 million acres. The first place they picked was Prudhoe Bay. So whoa. I said, wait a minute. Let's not do that.
And the idea was that we were at a stalemate in the state of Alaska for the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline. There was a lawsuit filed by the village of Stevens Village. Then there was actually a logjam, and a group of Alaska Natives got together and said this is the time to act on trying to acquire some of our Aboriginal lands.
In 1966, a Koyukon Athabascan man named Emil Nadi sent out a letter to a handful of Alaska Native leaders seeking a unified front.
I still have my invite from Emil Nadi with his little note saying, come on down a day or two earlier if you can. But, he thought he was inviting maybe a dozen people or so, because we weren't that many of us, right, back getting active at that time. But I think everybody began to sense the impending catastrophe of the loss of our lands, because there had been news about villages whose lands were being selected by the state, particularly between here and Fairbanks in the rail belt area. And so instead of having just a small number of people, maybe there might, Emil says 300, but it was a small room, above a fur shop, the AudioCam building downtown. Maybe there were 200 at the most, maybe.
And the convention came together in early 1967. It was funded primarily by the Tyonic people who had just gotten a $17 million settlement from the federal government for oil and gas leases.
During the formation, or talking about the formation and how AFN was going to come and who was going to be involved, some of the northern regions did not want Tlingit and Haida involved in the land claims at all, because they felt that the Tlingit and Haida lawsuit had settled the land or settled our claim, which it did not. It was just a financial settlement.
They had their own Claims Act settlement, and it didn't make very much. It was through Court of Claims.
They had laid claim, I think in 1929, saying the feds had taken away their timberland, and they had gotten a fairly significant settlement. So socially, by the standards of society, the metropolitan standards of society, their folks had gone to college, were used to dealing in commerce, were about a generation ahead in the world of commerce.
Tlingit Haida Central Council had been formed. The Alaska Native Brotherhood had been involved for several generations.
It was kind of an ill feeling that you're sitting there and you're negotiating and you're talking about the Claims Act in its totality, but the Tlinkits had two bites of the apple.
Even though they had given Tlingit and Haida money, that didn't satisfy us. We had to have land.
The Court of Claims was a dead ender. I mean, you spent years. I mean, you had to get a congressional resolution to sue the government. That takes time and money. And then they spent 35 years trying to get a measly $7.5 million and no land. I mean, that was our option, right? If we didn't get legislation, they're going to kick us off to this old Court of Claims, Indian Claims Commission setup, which was a total loser. You get pennies an acre and no land.
Arguments for and against the participation was emotional, sometimes heated. When went to a vote, the 25-member board split 12 to 12. I cast a tie-breaking vote. That brought in Tlingit and Haida with us to join AFN. We needed their experience, we needed their knowledge, we needed their support, and what we were trying to do went beyond Indian law. It went directly to Congress, bypassed the courts. We needed you.
Emerging from that was a unified concept. The Alaska First People had a claim to a substantial portion of Alaska and a substantial amount of money.
For the first time, the Alaska Native population had solidified into a singular vote.
And our starting position really was, okay, Uncle Sam, you've taken X amount of lands already in various national forest lands or petroleum reserves or whatever. We want the Court of Claims to decide which lands have been taken, and we want payment for those lands. And all the other lands we want back, right? That was our starting position. Of course, we understood that, this was an impossible proposition, but that's where we started.
Lands from around the state, one by one, were being claimed en masse by regional Native associations.
In fact, the natives of Alaska now claim over 90%, almost all of Alaska. Now, we can't spend all our time in the next 40 to 50 years litigating these claims, trying to get them decided through the courts.
While different Native groups had been claiming land for more than 30 years, this became a tsunami. And in its wake,
this, of course, precipitated a crisis for Alaska as a state, because the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, thankfully decided that maybe as trustee for Native lands that maybe he should not permit the state to have their interim conveyances, and that became known as the land freeze. And that land freeze was absolutely critical in the end, in my opinion, to getting Congress to act on a piece of legislation.
The land rights of the Alaska Natives have never been defined. This has always been put off. And they're going to get the shaft, they said, because the state now wants to pick some of the land that they've been living on and so on. And I said, well, how can I stop it? And they said, you can write a piece of paper that says Alaska can't select any more land until the Indian land rights are decided.
You know, it was a misuse of power, but out of it, I think we probably achieved more ownership of land than we would have done before because we really got our backs up. So, you know, I thought it was wrong at the time. I still think what's happened to the state is wrong, let alone the native corporations, in the sense that we had a right to 103 million acres of land as a state of our choosing that was not reserved at that time.
After Udall's land freeze in 1966, the whole state, which was economically hanging on by a thread, was paying attention. But sooner than anyone expected, the entire country started watching the young state very closely as well.
In the spring of 1968, a vast oil discovery was discovered in Prudhoe Bay.
In 1968, at Prudhoe Bay, the largest pool of oil on the North American continent was discovered.
Alaska would have gone from a beggar state to a very rich state if the pipeline was built. My first year in Alaska, 1965, the big debate was whether Alaska was going to exceed $100 million on its budget.
Alaska's at a standstill. Our hands are tied. Until this problem is settled, there can be no meaningful development, no economic development in Alaska. The pipeline, our Alaska pipeline, is just one of the projects we very desperately need. And we've all been told by the pipeline company that the pipeline is not going to move 1 inch until this settlement is made.
It all sort of came into high gear, you know, with the discovery of Prudhoe Bay in 1968.
The industry all had to say a lot to do with it too. You know, I mean, they had big money, and they had a lot of influence in Congress.
All of a sudden, you know, it amped up the issue of who owns Alaska, because the country needed the oil. Alaska was on its sort of last leg, so to speak. It was barely surviving because it didn't have enough revenue. And so all of a sudden, here was a potential source to allow Alaska to exist as a state. I have to compliment Wally Hickel in retrospect, because he was the first elected official to support the 40 million acres.
Governor Hickel created the Land Claims Task Force in 1968 to try and get the state on board with a plan to which the Alaska Native community would agree.
Wally was, you know, pragmatic. I mean, don't get me wrong. We fought him tooth and tongue because he was trying to kill the land claims, the land freeze, because it was having a financial impact on the state.
I can say this, I believe Wally Hickel was really pushing this because he wanted to get the pipeline built.
And we had a very tight time frame to come up with recommendations to give to Governor Hickel and the state, but we methodically went through all the issues.
The set of recommendations that came out of the task force in 1969 became a pivotal reference point and symbolized cooperation between the two groups. It included giving the Alaska Natives 40 million acres of land and regional corporations. And that was all happening while Senator Ernest Greening, who lost in the primary, was trying to hold on to the seat through a write-in.
And write in Greening, or use a sticker. You'll be glad you did. Stick with Greening. He can do more for Alaska.
Against him, former Speaker of the Alaska House, Mike Gravel.
These people have to regain their birthright. I think one of the ways that they're going to do it, I think the Native people will do it through their land claims.
Senator Gravel beat Senator Greening in a primary, primarily by promising the Alaska Native community that he would introduce legislation.
But 1968 was a crazy year in Alaska's political history, and right before Gravel took office, Senator Bob Bartlett died, and that allowed Governor Hickel to pick his replacement.
Ted Stevens was appointed after Senator Bartlett died, and Stevens was actually the senior senator because he was sworn in before Gravel.
You know, I was 10 years old when my father went to the Senate. The Settlement Claims Act really was right out of the chute when my father went to Congress in 1968, late 68, early 69.
On the national stage, in entered newly elected President Richard Nixon.
Greatness comes in simple trappings.
Stevens had been solicitor of the Department of the Interior, and Hickel recommended him to President Nixon to be Secretary of the Interior. Nixon didn't like Stevens because Stevens was too liberal, so he asked Hickel to take the job.
When he was nominated to be secretary, it was a shock to us because we knew that his idea was to go to Washington, get rid of that land freeze, and build that pipeline in order to save Alaska.
Stevens was known for his outspoken temper, and during the Hickel confirmation hearings, he was yelling at witnesses, screaming at people. And one day, Scoop Jackson came into the office, and Stevens and I, since he was so low ranking, we actually shared an office. We're sitting there, and Jackson said, "Calm down. You and I are going to have a great future together. We're going to get your guy confirmed. We're going to settle Alaska Native claims. But the first thing I want you to do," and he handed him a card, "is go to my tailor and get some suits so you can look like a senator." That was the beginning of a lifelong friendship.
Really, in the end, it's about relationships, and the relationship that the Alaskan Natives developed with the leaders, i.e. Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, and the relationship that my dad had with Scoop Jackson. I think people forget about that relationship and the importance of that. But Scoop Jackson was one of the leaders in the U.S. Senate in the 50s that fought for statehood.
Senator Stevens' close friendship with Scoop Jackson turned out to be one of the key ingredients for Alaska in the fight for land claims.
And people forget that, he went into to the U.S. Senate when there was 34 Republicans.
Back then, people knew they had to give and take. It was a better atmosphere, I think, back then, and people agreed to disagree, or they sat down and talked about it and worked out some agreements.
He really expanded, and he brought people to Washington, D.C. He encouraged Alaska leaders to come down and to establish individual personal relationships with the decision makers.
Throughout the battle for land claims, Senator Stevens was known as a great facilitator who loved inviting people into his home to talk through ideas around a dinner table.
Oh, all the time. My dad would call up, "Hey, we got this guy coming." The next thing you know, 18 people would show up for dinner. My mom just wouldn't bat an eye, send us to the store, go buy Frito pie, it doesn't matter what we served. But it was different back then. People, and besides that, they're Alaskans. Alaskans don't care. And like I said, it was to witness, a lot of heated discussions, a lot of people talking back and forth with all the different factions. But it was, people working it out. And it wasn't just 1 year. It wasn't just one event. It was continuous.
Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, the team was forming to help address land claims.
On the Senate side, it came down to Senator Jackson, Senator Stevens, Bill Van Ness, myself, Gravel's guy, Mike Rowan, to do the initial drafting on this.
There is no way to do it so that everybody can be happy. There's no way to do it other than to just get the best possible compromise we can and to get the deal made so that it will be a good deal for all Alaskans, natives and non-natives alike.
Gravel, as his first act in the Senate, introduced a bill to give Alaska Natives $100 million and 10 million acres of land in fee simple. The ranking member on the Interior Committee, Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, said, "Over my dead body."
The initial version of the compromise put out by the Senate in the 91st Congress was not well received by many in the Senate or Alaska Natives.
The Federal Field Committee recommendation that was contracted by the chairman of the Senate Committee, Senator Jackson, their idea was basically to end up with no indigenous institution at all. They were going to issue stock. In 10 years, it was going to go public. We would have no village corporations, no regional corporation. And then on the other side, on the federal side, as much as we loved Udall, his idea was old school, right? Reservations, types land, a small, I mean, his idea of a generous settlement was like $180 million.
They wanted to give us $100 million. They wanted to give us $10 million. They wanted to give nothing. And a little bit of land. Some of the proposals were like 10 million acres and $100,000. No.
The bill passed the Senate and died in the House. By the end of that session, with no one happy and no compromise made, Stevens, who tried to make inroads through compromise, started vocalizing more openly a different approach.
Stevens told me that he wanted two things. He said, I want justice done for the Alaska Native community, but primarily, in addition to getting justice for the Alaska people, I want to get every goddamn acre I can away from the federal government and into private ownership.
Alaska today is 95% federal land. And if you really want to look at the bill that way, it frees our state land selections so that if it gives anybody anything, it's giving the state the 103.5 million acres we got at statehood. The state land selections are my primary goal in working on this land claims bill, along with justice for our Native people.
The reaction of the business community, particularly in Anchorage, was very negative.
That was a hard thing because there were, like I say, a lot of people in Alaska didn't think anybody, the Aboriginals, should get any more than they've got. And the problem I had in Ted finally convinced them this is literally taking the land away from the federal government for the guys in New York and California. And the only thing of regrets I have, we did get 100 million acres of land. You know, it's better in the natives' hands than it is in the agency's hands.
Ted was receiving pushback on the idea from Wally Hickle's replacement, Governor Keith Miller, who had sided with the Anchorage business community. But luckily enough for land claims, the governor's race back home ended up seeing the political end of both Keith Miller's time in the governor's mansion, as well as Howard Pollock's tenure as Alaska's lone representative.
So it wasn't until Begich replaced Pollock that you had a Democrat in the House who could work well with Aspinall. And Begich was a terrific congressman.
And Aspen was a crusty, difficult guy, and he had a feeling about what this settlement should be was a lot less generous than what we ultimately agreed that it should be. They were going to control the Native settlement team no matter what. They were not going to let it go by without them dealing with every word of it.
Nick Begich's entrance after the 1970 election finally opened up the possibility of passing a bill. Because, just like the position of Scoop Jackson in the Senate, Congressman Wayne Aspinall could kill the whole deal at any time.
That he controlled a lot of that bill. And we did, in a sense, did too, because, I mean, really Nick's job and my job was to do the best we could to work on that. And he wouldn't deal with everybody.
With Congressman Aspinall on board, the final roadblock to a conference committee and reconciling the differences between the two bills was gone. And thanks to a push from the Nixon administration, the Alaska Native people finally had a bill that included the 40 million acres that was originally agreed to by Hickle and continually pushed by Senator Stevens.
We all basically understood that we would probably never get the forces together again to get something as complex and in the context of American Indians as generous as this one. So we took a chance and we took it and have been running with it for 50 years.
Whether it'll ever happen again, I don't know. But you're going to find out in the long run is probably more important to the state, this act itself, than statehood itself, as far as generating an economy and as far as the whole concept.
When you look back and you think about, again, this very novel concept. This is not anything close to the settlements, the treaties in the lower 48 with assigned reservation status. This was about a level of economic empowerment that was kind of a novel vision.
We were at an AFN meeting in Anchorage when we got the call that the president had signed it. That was very exciting. I remember jumping up and, with everybody else and hollering and clapping and how happy we all were. So that was 50 years ago. I can't believe it.
Ted was a very forceful senator, a very good person, know him well, and he believed in it. That's the thing that I was proud. If you go back and read the records, his speeches, his comments, his dedication to it convinced Alaskan he was right.
None of us knew how to run a business. When you had to be a businessman, the most impressive thing was you carry a briefcase. There was not a briefcase in town you could buy. You open them up, pair of mucklucks, some dried fish. There was no paperwork in them. Even if it was the last dime they'd buy a briefcase, carry it along. And I'm a businessman,